ocean breeze spits in the face of Hernan Cortes. Standing on the deck of his flagship, he wipes sea splatter from his face and concentrates on the voyage forward. It had been 6 months since we absconded from Cuba on an expedition whose legality was no longer certain. Half a year later, he now sees himself following the last traces of the voyage mapped out by Cordoba and Grijalva before him. What lies beyond the shallow coastal discovery of these 2 previous expeditions is unknown but enticing. Rumors of gold and treasure beyond comprehension. Cortes takes stock of his provisions and his men. They have little of each. Already, many of the men are nursing wounds from their first skirmish on the Yucatan, but morale remains high if temperamental. Cortes takes off the iron helmet he wears at all times and smooths back his thick, dark hair. The salt of seawater mixes with the salt of his sweat, which drips down his neck and his back. He is joined on deck by his friend Alonso Portocarrero, a relation of the Count of the town from which both men hail from. These 2 have secretly discussed the long-term goals of this expedition between them, to betray the governor's orders and colonize the land for themselves. They talked about this first in secret, cautious of those aboard still loyal to Governor Velazquez back in Cuba. But as time goes on, their ambitions can't help but spill out into the open. The farther they are from Cuba, the brasher they become. Portocarrero stares off at the shore coming into view ahead and quotes a chivalric poem. Behold France, Montesinos, behold Paris the city, behold the waters of the Douro which flow down to the sea. He adds to the poem that he believes that Cortes is looking off to rich lands he believes that he will govern well. Cortes responds in kind. Let God give us that good fortune in fighting which he gave to the paladin Roland. After all, with you and these other gentlemen, as leaders, I will easily learn to manage things. As the ship comes closer and closer to shore, 2 conspiracies float in Cortes's mind. The conspiracy of the Velazquistas who question Cortes and resist his orders, and the conspiracy of Cortes himself, who he sees as divinely appointed to lead an expedition of God into an unknown land. But every day they come closer to the end of their mission is another day of opportunity for his enemies to orchestrate their mutiny and sail back to Cuba. It will take conspiring of their own for Cortes and his allies to stay ahead of this. Once the knives come out, there will be no putting them back in. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. No figure looms larger in the popular history of the so-called conquest of Mexico than that of Hernan Cortes. As it is often understood, he is the great man of this history, conquering an empire near single-handedly, assisted only by his personal army of 200 Spaniards and some indigenous allies, whose numbers and contributions so often go unspecified. He was, as we think, the man of his moment. But no element of the memory of the Spanish-Aztec War is as much a victim of history's conspiratorial elements as that of Hernan Cortes's involvement. The Cortes we remember is an invention, a chivalric tale inspired by those of Amadis de Gaula and other knightly romances printed in his time. Cortes was less a commander than he was a stage manager of the egos and internal politics of his band of Spanish marauders. He held together his expedition by promises of power and treasure he offered out as a credit that he hoped to back with plundered gold later. He was assisted in this by the intervention of his unruly captains, each of whom pursued their own goals and bucked his authority openly. But Cortes's true innovation of his time was in the manipulation of the written word. With the sole account of the conquest written at his dictation, he invented the history as it was happening and cast himself as its protagonist. The stories he told were believed because he wrote them in a way that flattered what people wanted to believe. Invented titles, promises of riches, and a destiny to conquer ordained by God himself. This episode is about how a man's need to make his fiction stick created a brittle command, and a campaign filled with captains ready to make their own stories known. Cortes's account, which we will deal with in greater detail later, prompts us to recall Ramon Maria de Valle Inclán's aphorism, "Things are not how we see them, but as we remember them." So let's see what is remembered as we continue Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 1.5, Hernan Cortes, Pirate of the Yucatan. Hernan Cortes was born in Medellin in 1485. He was born in a region named Extremadura, a large, rocky, and difficult part of Spain in its southwest, not too far from Granada and the last bastion of Muslims which would finally be conquered when he was 7 years old. Historian Hugh Thomas describes his background. He was descended from some of the most turbulent families in the most undisciplined of towns, Medellin, in Extremadura, the wildest part of Castile. He was an offspring of an immense extended family of hidalgos of that region, with which almost all those who went to America from there had some connection. His father, Martin Cortes, is usually described as an infantryman, a poor soldier who, though a gentleman, a hidalgo, or minor nobleman, could not afford to buy a horse to take himself to go to war. Cortes himself would speak little of his childhood in any surviving documents, and little more has been uncovered since his death. It was, in all likelihood, uneventful, and so the young Cortes wanted what most young men want, adventure in a faraway land. For his choice, he wavered between joining King Ferdinand's Italian campaigns or heading for the new colonies of the West Indies. But first, at the age of 15, he was sent to university in Salamanca to study law. It is said there he saw a lecture given by Cristobal Colon and was inspired by such to sail away to the rumored colonies as soon as possible. It's certainly an impressive story, positioning the tale of the discoverer of Americas and its greatest conqueror as though they were star-crossed. But in practice, it reads more like an invention of an excited biographer fiddling in the margins of history. There is serious doubt that Cortes actually attended even those few years of school, and that his notary training came on the job later in Hispaniola and Cuba. But Cortes wouldn't reach those islands, at least not at first. The story goes that Cortes, a lifelong womanizer, had been in bed with his latest mistress when her husband came home. Cortes, in desperation, jumped from a window and broke his leg. The expedition he was set to join set sail without him as he laid in recovery. It would take until he was 19 years old before he got his chance again, and would finally land in Hispaniola in the year 1504. On the island, he was known for his lavish spending, constant gambling, and enormous debts. They were defining aspects of his character, and ones that would follow and haunt him to his dying days. A reputation formed in the boredom and existential futility of being an encomendero in the dying Caribbean empire. He quickly fell under the influence of Diego Velázquez, who at the time was deputy administrator of the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and who we met 2 episodes ago. They were, it seems, fated to become the best of enemies, and that permanent rift between the men began the moment that Cortes rowed out from the docks in Cuba toward his own brigantines, while his old patron shouted after him. In that moment, Cortes feigned subservience to cover his own insubordination, humiliating Velázquez. Cortes set sail not as a hero or a captain, but as a mutineer. And so, on the outset of his expedition, Cortes was a man on the run, someone who had gambled on the success of an expedition, chasing after rumors of riches, while his colonial holdings back in Cuba lay in the hands of the man who would become his most bitter opponent. And so it was total success or complete failure for Cortes, a fear which festered in the back of his mind throughout the entirety of the next several years of his struggles in the land he was set to land on. At 34 years old, Cortes was at an age at which many a person's fortunes in life hinge on the successes and failures of their prime adult years. For Cortes, the gulf between success and failure could not have been any wider. If it was a gamble, then Cortes was in his element. Contemporaries would later say that he was always at his most comfortable when he was risking it all, and he was later remarked upon for the coolness of his nerve whether he won or lost. There was always a next step with Cortes. And so his expedition set out for Cozumel, that island off the coast of the Yucatan's eastern coast. set on following the first route explored by both Cordoba and Grijalva expeditions. On board across his small fleet were captains whose names we will return to again and again this season. These men were half dreamers, half debtors, all of whom knew that the Spanish Empire's greatest lesson to learn was in subjecting the law to action and not the other way around. In contrast to our mental image of soldiers bedecked in armor, this was not an army, but a coalition of convenience. On board, there was Pedro de Albador, the detonator, blonde, beautiful, and belligerent. He was of a family of conquistadores famous for their tempers. And Alvarado was famous for not waiting for orders so much as preempting them with violence of his own. Violence that buried all doubts about the bodies he so often left behind. Next was Gonzalo de Sandoval, the boy wonder. Young, fast, and of a methodical mind, Sandoval was youthful and untested at the beginning of the Cortesista expedition, but would eventually establish himself as Cortes's right-hand man and adapt his mentor's penchant for strategic terror to deadly effect. Following that was Cristobal de Olid, the ambitious broker. A Velazquista through and through, he represented the more vocally Cortes-skeptical factions of the expedition. But his true loyalty lay with the opportunity, and he was always willing to put aside his conscience for his own chance at the great man myth. Then we have Andres de Tapia, the practical hand. Neither flashy nor unpredictable, Tapia was a logistician, keeping the expedition running without flair. And he was exactly the kind of man to assist Cortes in turning this fantastic story into improvised legalism. Following that were Francisco de Montejo and Pedro de Porcarrero, the suggestible Velazquistas. The former, a stern administrator who represented the middle-class elements of the Spanish Empire. The latter was a sloppy, rude minor noble coasting on the dying estate of his family's name. Both of them would figure prominently in the Cortesista campaign's rear flank action against the intrigues of the Spanish court. And finally, there was Bernal Diaz, the memory merchant, not a captain, but a soldier, whose importance would come decades later as the talkative, self-mythologizing eyewitness in the form of his Baudry memoir. Like Cortes, Diaz's memory rings loudly in the storytelling of this history. On board his ships were both Melchor, a Maya who had been captured in the Cordoba expedition, and a Nahuatl-speaking native that had been named Francisco upon being captured by Grijalva a few months earlier. But these interpreters were often unreliable, poorly trained, and unwilling to perform their functions. Indeed, it seemed that Melchor and his deceased compatriot Julian had told tall tales about their homeland in an effort to induce the Spaniards to return. Once the ships had returned to their homeland, it seemed that they had planned to flee the expedition entirely. There were 2 men of God aboard, including Father Bartolomé de Olmedo and Father Juan Diaz, both of them sent to convert the heathens of these lands to Christianity as they saw fit. There were also a number of infantrymen, several dozen horsemen, 12 arquebusiers, a kind of mounted prototype gun, and 30 crossbowmen. There were also several pieces of artillery and numerous dogs, whose viciousness in battle stretched back to the days of the Reconquista, and whose savagery of attacking prompted the creation of a new verb in Spanish, aperrear, to be thrown to the dogs. The truth was that these men weren't soldiers, and only the most prestigious and most important among them were even paid directly ahead of time by Cortes. The rest of them were a mix of middle-class and minor noble types, exactly the kind who sought to conquer the fortunes they were denied back in Spain. All of these men were expected to furnish their own equipment, horses, and feed. All began their adventure heavily indebted, and rabid at the thought of acquiring the material wealth that would make their expenses and time worth it. They were artisans, craftsmen, brigands, runaway criminals, and everything and anything in between. They were a ragtag team of opportunists whose fortune lay with the gentlemanly pirate of Cortes. Still, their expedition was not without precedent in the stately affairs of Spain. They were following in the medieval traditions of conquest that had seen their country unite in expelling first the Moors and then the Jews before turning its attention to the Canary Islands off the western coast of Africa. Cortes with his notary experience in the Caribbean, was keenly aware of the precarious legal position that his entire expedition was in. With these several hundred conquistadores, it must be said, were an unknown number of both Taino and African slaves, whose contributions to this expedition came mostly in working as porters, carrying the equipment of the men who claimed all the credit and shared none of the glory. Their contributions, nearly silent in the historical record, have been too often ignored, as the story of the men on these ships has been told as if their superhuman strength had been enough to haul their armor, weapons, ammunition, and food with them across leagues of some of the most treacherous terrain in the Americas. And so it was this group of men that set off toward Cozumel from Cuba, now in the early months of 1519. On their first night out at sea, there was a raging storm which separated the fleet, with Cortes's ship being knocked the furthest off course. Their destination, Cozumel, was well known to the Spanish and the first rendezvous point for the men to reach in case of separation. Cortes's ship was not the first to reach the island, and he found that Pedro de Alvarado had arrived ahead of him. Both of them had reached the same island that Juan Grijalva had landed on less than a year earlier. And just as Grijalva had found it, the local Maya settlements were abandoned when Cortes landed ashore, for the locals had fled into the interior of the island. Unlike Grijalva, however, Alvarado had taken it upon himself, having landed before his captain, to seize the city and terrorize whatever inhabitants remained and loot temples and homes for gold and other treasures. Alvarado, who had openly chafed under Grijalva's discretion and temperance in the face of treasure, sought to set the tone of this new expedition early when he looted what he could of the Cozumel Maya. But Cortes was not ready to threaten the relationship between the Spanish and the indigenous, while it was still uncertain what exactly the stakes were. Less merciful than he was far-sighted compared to the infamously impulsive Alvarado, Cortes ordered the loot returned and gestures made toward the natives to repair relationships. Politically minded, Cortes understood there were benefits to establishing positive alliances with the natives first, if only to be able to understand and exploit their weaknesses later. The wife of the village cacique was found hiding in one house. Cortes demanded Melchor translate his messages of peace to the woman, and invited her back to bring her husband and all of their neighbors to the village so that an official exchange of gifts could be made. To her terrified children cowering in the house with her, Cortes offered trinkets and toys to entice them. The woman relented, going out to retrieve the villagers. Cortes ordered that Alvarado return the ill-gotten loot to where he had found it. When the people returned, they perfumed the Spaniards with incense, a ritual that would repeat in the many villages and later Altepeme that the Spaniards would encounter. They found this ritual strange, but in fact it was practical. The people of Mesoamerica, particularly those of the Aztec Empire, were notorious bathers with excellent hygiene who found personal uncleanliness offensive. The Spaniards found over-attentiveness to bathing to be vain and sinful, and, sweating in the stinking in the tropics of Mexico underneath their armor, often arrived by scent before sight. The incense was a polite way of bridging a cultural divide. The cacique came out of the forest and met with Cortes, asking what it was that he wanted. Cortes announced his intention to come to this land, to seek fortune and spread word of the new law, the law of the one true God. At this point, Cortes indicated toward the pyramid of the Maya goddess Ixche, and stated these were false gods that the Maya were worshipping, and insisted to the people that they destroy them to save their souls. In exchange, Cortes offered to hoist up an image of the Virgin Mary and a cross so that they might achieve salvation. How these people received this offer is not known. The topic of Cortes's Christianity has been a source of fierce debate between those who saw Cortes as a genuine servant of his faith and those who saw him as nothing more than a cynical opportunist. As Hugh Thomas puts it, the truth seems to be that, though a sincere Christian, Cortes was quite able to combine Christian beliefs and actions with the realization that these things were useful. The motives of Cortes, like those of Columbus, were inextricably mixed. Above all, no doubt, he wanted glory. He also wanted wealth, and, where appropriate or convenient, he also wanted to serve God. Even his contemporaries were divided on the sincerity of his Christian beliefs. Others observed with disdain that Cortes's favorite saying, "by my conscience," rang hollow, since he was said to have no more conscience than a dog. Regardless of his sincerity, Cortes would make efforts to announce the Christian faith wherever he went, delivering impromptu sermons to incredulous natives who were sometimes fascinated and oftentimes bored with the proselytizing of this strange man with his strange religion. As Cortes tried to speak about his beliefs and the dangers of Maya idolatry, he did so through his translator Melchor, a translator who was only inadequately trained and desperate to escape. All of Cortes's words must have sounded near incoherent and incomprehensible to the Maya cacique. Nevertheless, he politely retorted that these gods had served his people well in the past and that they were willing to accommodate this new woman god of the Spaniards, but they were unwilling to do so at the expense of their existing pantheon. The concept of religious absolutism that the Spanish would bring with them was utterly foreign to these people and constantly mystified them with its rigidity. The Maya chieftain also told Cortes of Christians who had been shipwrecked off the Yucatan some years earlier and lost in Maya territory. Cortes and his captains all understood the enormous potential of having a native Spaniard to translate the local languages. Cortes asked the Maya chieftain to send word to the supposed Maya that the Spanish were here and that they were looking for their own men, but the Maya chieftain declined, out of fear that any of his people who were sent would be eaten by their rival tribe. Cortes instead ordered that Diego de Ordaz, another dedicated Velasquista, and several other men go to the Yucatan and deliver a message to the tribe that the Spanish were here, so that it might find its way to the missing countrymen that they had inside. Cortes also insisted that they remain anchored off the Yucatan for a week, waiting for word to come of these men. Some of Cortes's captains disagreed with him on the length of their stay. Every day spent aboard the ship was a day spent consuming provisions and water which they did not have to spare. But Cortes insisted on using at least 3 days to give these supposed indigenized Spaniards a chance of joining them. A week passed without word. Disappointed, Cortes and company were ready to pull up their anchor and set sail when they saw a canoe of Maya paddling toward them. As the canoe came closer, they saw that, sandwiched between the Maya at the front and the Maya at the back of the canoe, was a man who asked in broken Spanish, "Are you Christians?" The men aboard the ship responded that they were, and the Spaniard in the canoe began to rejoice. Quickly, they pulled him aboard while his Maya comrades remained in the canoe and paddled away. The rescued man's name was Geronimo de Aguilar. Nearly a decade ago, he had been marooned in the Yucatan when his ship bound for Jamaica had been destroyed in a storm. He and nearly a dozen others had made it to shore before being captured by local Maya, who intended them all for sacrifice. Some of them were killed for this purpose before Aguilar and several others, including a man named Gonzalo Guerrero, were able to make their escape. Their good fortune took a turn when the next Maya tribe they found enslaved them. Though, rather intending them for sacrifice, they put the Spaniards to work. When news of Geronimo's disappearance reached his mother on the other side of the ocean, it was said that she wept at the thought that her son may have been sacrificed and eaten. And so she abstained from eating any meat further, saying, "That is the son of my flesh, am I not the most unhappy of mothers?" All but Aguilar and Guerrero died under the toil of the slavery they were subjected to. Over the years, both men were able to earn their freedom in the Maya tribe and pick up the Yucatec dialect of Maya and speak it fluently, though each gradually lost their Spanish along the way. Guerrero proved himself to be an able warrior and earned respect among his tribe in the fights he was able to lead against rival Maya. He married the daughter of the chief and went fully native, covering his body in the cultural tattoos and piercings of the Maya, and began to be accepted as one of their own. He had children with his wife who were among the first process of mestizaje that would come to define the entirety of Spanish Americas. Aguilar never fully accepted his position, however, and in the Maya community he maintained his Christianity, holding out hope that one day he might be rescued by some Spanish. When rumors spread throughout the Maya lands that there were strange men living off in the waters, Aguilar took notice and negotiated his way into receiving a canoe and 2 Maya to help him paddle towards the anchored strangers so that he might rejoin his fellow Christians. He made it just in time, though he found his mother language returned to him quickly while in the presence of his countrymen, though it would never again be fully fluent. Guerrero had also been told of the arrival of the Spanish, and Aguilar had pleaded with him to return to his Christian brothers so that he might save his own soul. But Guerrero had no interest in abandoning his family and home and remained. What happened to Guerrero is not fully confirmed. Years later, however, during a battle between Spanish colonizers in the Yucatan and the Maya, it was said that a body of a white Maya was found among them that looked curiously like a Spaniard. It seems that Guerrero, whose name means warrior in Spanish, had died true to his name in the defense of the home he was not born into but had chosen. And so the voyage continued, with only one of the two Spaniards recovered. It was now late March, and sailing up the coast, they arrived at the river of Pontonchan. It was too narrow for ships, so the Spaniards crammed into rowboats, paddles swallowed by the water. On the banks, the Mayas stood in their cotton garments, silent and unmoving. Hundreds of eyes fixed on them, watching, measuring. Cortes spoke through Aguilar, recalling his own friendship with Grijalva for their goodwill. He knew the lie was thin and that the Maya saw through it. His only friend was gold, and they knew that too. The Maya told him to return tomorrow. Harmless words, but Cortes heard the threat behind them. That night, Pontonchan emptied its women and children. Not chance, but an evacuation. His own men dragged up more guns, checked powder again and again, and glanced toward the dark tree line where unseen eyes surely waited. Every rustle in the night felt like an ambush being rehearsed. Maya drumbeats frayed their nerves as they feigned sleep. Bugs and heat devoured them. The next morning, Maya leaders came with food and a mask of gold, a lure. Cortes demanded more. The Maya refused and told them to leave. He stayed. Each day the same. Patient smiles, measured gifts, always promises of tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Cortes knew that the clock was running, and knew that the Maya were buying time. He sent Alvarado upriver with the horsemen. He read the requerimiento to an abandoned town, untranslated, barely heard by those who lingered behind. It was a formality to conflict that was now fulfilled. By the fourth day, Cortes could feel the situation slipping out of his hand, the theater of it all fraying. He insisted he must enter the town, that he had advice for them. The Maya laughed. His demand turned sharper. Submit to Spain or else. He could see it then, the mask dropping and the patience snapping. The Maya had had enough. And before he could ready another lie, another threat, the sky blackened with stones, darts, and arrows. Cortes and his men prepare for the worst, and they receive it. A volley of stones and arrows thudded down on them, bouncing off the boats and lodging themselves in the exposed flesh of Spaniards. The first battle of the Cortesista expedition begins. The artillery are near useless, struggling to get a position in the ground and firing wildly, and inaccurately, toward the Maya. The Maya are at first frightened, but also adaptable. They recover their wits quickly. The men struggle to get ashore and meet the Maya face to face. They storm the beach clumsily, as though their uncertainty of this world extends to the very sand which shifts and swallows underneath their feet. Cortes, leading the charge, loses a boot in the muck and plants his first step onto the continent of his destiny barefoot. But there is more than just boots at stake here. These are the tendrils of history, wrapping around themselves and contorting into a knot. The Maya answer to this knot is a razor-sharp obsidian-tipped paddle called a macohuit in Nahuatl. The Spanish retort with the Spanish sword of Toledan steel. The two sides meet, hacking away at each other in a clash of competing ideas of how to kill a man. Spanish steel cuts through cotton armor, while Maya macohuit bludgeons against Spanish plate. Despite their technological superiority, the Spanish lack the edge. The Maya fight fiercely, ceremoniously, as though it were a great dance to them. The Spanish are fighting with a desperate fear. For many of them, Cortes included, this is the first battle they have ever been in. The momentum begins to slip, and some of the men begin to wonder what it will mean to retreat through the muck from where they came. Just then, Alvarado and his men flank the Maya, storming them with their horses. The cavalry charge is deadly and terrorizing. The Maya have never seen beasts like these. None exist in the New World. and it is said that some of them believe the men riding them are a kind of centaur. The initiative is lost. The Maya have no stomach for fighting a lost cause and capitulate in order to preserve themselves in defeat. Cortes accepts this defeat by marching into Pontonchan and slashing his mark into a ceiba tree, a tree of great cultural significance to the Maya. His wounded men cut fat from the bodies of dead Maya to use as their seal for their wounds. The Cortesistas have won their first battle in the New World. Further victories would not come so easily. The Spanish took many Maya captive. Aguilar translated the terms of their defeat. The Maya understood the power at play more than the language. Defeat, like victory, has its own grammar. It took several days to settle the Spanish terms. 20 leaders of Pontonchan met the Spaniards and gave them food and gold in tribute. Cortes lectured them on Christianity and vassalage to a faraway king they did not understand. Cortes would later write they were eager to hear more about this Spanish king, but it seems more likely that the Maya agreed to a useless promise of loyalty to a king that did not exist in their world as a small price to pay to get the Spanish to leave. Cortes demanded they smash their idols to accept their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The Maya, furious that their own gods had abandoned them in battle, complied. Cortes saw spiritual conquest. The Maya were only following a script of defeated people across the land. The destruction of pyramids and idols traditionally marked the final defeat of a city. Cortes relished in his victory and had a cannon fired to frighten the natives. The natives marveled at the Spanish swords, which killed instead of maimed, as the native Macawit was intended to do. All of this had the effect that Cortes intended, and the Maya offered a final component of tribute, one which would turn out to be the most important of all, though no one at the time could have realized it. The Maya presented the Spanish with 20 slave women, inviting these foreigners to do with them as they pleased. The Spanish preserved their mortal souls by having the priests baptize these women before they violated them. Each of the women were given Spanish names. One of them, said to have been the most beautiful of all, was regifted by Cortes to Alonso de Portocarrero, a relation to the Count of Medellin, a promise of his loyalty to the Spanish hierarchy. It was a gift he would later renege on. The Spanish would stay in Pontonchan for 3 weeks, leaving on the 17th of April and returning to their ships. From there, they would sail up to the southern coast of the Gulf of Mexico as Grijalva had done, finally arriving at the island of Ulua, which Grijalva had named the year prior. It took them 3 days. They encountered other natives around this time that Cortes demanded Aguilar translate his Spanish for. Aguilar attempted to speak to them in his Maya dialect, but found that the language of these people was unintelligible to him. Cortes grew frustrated with his interpreter, hurling verbal abuse and lamenting the lack of language skills in his only translator. It was only then that one of the slaves given by the Maya, the one Cortes had given to Portocarrero, stood out and said, in Yucatec Maya to Aguilar, that the language the people were speaking was Nahuatl, the language of the people of the Aztec Empire, in the woman's own mother tongue. Thus began the legacy of the woman who would be known to history by many names, none of which her own, and is best known today as La Malinche. Cortes understood the importance of this woman immediately, and seized her from Portocarrero. It was perhaps the single most fortuitous moment in the Cortesista expedition, a stroke of luck which would facilitate the Spaniards' greatest successes and doom the woman herself to historical infamy. But for now, a link of translation was born. Cortes would speak to Aguilar in Spanish. Aguilar would speak to La Malinche in Maya, and La Malinche would speak to the indigenous in Nahuatl, before the message was relayed back to Cortes in reverse order. It was a tedious, cumbersome process subject to all sorts of possible misunderstandings, biases, and opportunism from the translators involved. Translators whose motivations and accuracy we'll never know. But it provided an essential link of communication between the Spanish and the people they wished to conquer. From this translator, Cortes learned that the people were part of a mighty empire, led by the fearsome Emperor Moctezuma from the floating city of Tenochtitlan, and that the land they were now in was near the lands of a people known as the Totonacs, a people conquered by the Aztecs and restless in their vassalage. Cortes decided to leave the island of Ulua for the mainland, about a mile away, with a smaller grouping of his forces into what was known as Totonac country. The Totonacs had been overjoyed at the arrival of Grijalva months ago. They thought of him as a potential ally in their struggle against the Aztecs and wept at his departure. And they could hardly believe their luck now upon seeing a return of the same people they had written off for good a year prior. The Spanish were received warmly with presents and affection. To his frustration, Cortes found that these Totonacs spoke yet another language that was unknown to both Aguilar and La Malinche, and was forced to communicate via gestures for the time being. Despite the awkwardness of communication, the Totonacs remained obviously friendly. Eventually, a Totonac was found who could also speak Nahuatl, and another link was added in the chain of translation. The Totonacs said how happy they were to see the Spanish again, and even asked them about specific members of the crew of the last ship, Pedro de Alvarado among them. Cortes, unaware of the politics of the empire, but understanding that there must be some angle to the Totonac friendliness, received their hospitality openly and returned it in kind with the agreement of his captains. Silver and gold ornaments caught the eye of the Spanish. They tossed aside decorum and demanded to know where it came from. The Totonacs skillfully claimed it came from far away. The exchange revealed something of each to both, Spanish motives and Totonac fickleness. A table was assembled by the Spanish in which representatives of each side could offer gifts or trades. A celebration was had, and the mood relaxed considerably among the Spanish camp. Their reception by the Totonacs could not have been any starker from that of the Maya, and they felt themselves, perhaps for the first time in weeks, relaxing. The next day was Easter Sunday. The Spanish held a mass in view of the Totonacs, and Cortes went about his usual proselytizing of the merits of Catholicism and the one true God. The Totonacs listened politely, but without any commitment. But this day was remarkable not only for its religious significance, but for its diplomatic one as well. Arriving at just this time was a man named Tentlil, an emissary of the Aztec Empire. As far as is known to history, this is the first meeting between the Spanish and the Mexica. It would prove to be an awkward one. Tentlil arrived with all the pomposity one would expect of the late-era Mexica visiting a tributary. He had thousands of servants, literal tons of food, and a bevy of jewels and precious objects to distribute. Tentlil announced himself to the Spaniards in the high register of Nahuatl exclusively spoken by the nobility. La Malinche, unnoticed by Aguilar but certainly noticed with surprise by Tentlil, responded to the Mexica diplomat in the same register, betraying her own noble upbringing once upon a time. Tentlil said that he had come from the city of Tenochtitlan, capital of the empire, at the behest of his Tlatoani Moctezuma, who had heard of the Spaniards' victory at Potonchan and wished to congratulate them. He distributed many objects as gifts to the Spanish, part of a carefully considered diplomatic strategy of Moctezuma's, and announced that 2,000 of the servants with him were now at the disposal of the Spaniards. According to Hugh Thomas, among the 2,000 were doubtless spies, priests, and sorcerers of the Aztecs meant to disrupt the Spanish with spying and shamanism. The Spanish were aware of none of this. They did not understand that landing in Totonac country at all trapped them further in the blood feuds of the people living there. They were no longer commanders of their own destinies, but pawns in a different campaign altogether. It was the arrival of this man who reconfigured everything in the Cortesista expedition. Whenever it now cost, Cortes was determined to march on Tenochtitlan, confront its emperor, and demand his vassalage to the only king Cortes recognized. Cortes engaged Tentlil in conversation, announcing his usual diplomatic mission and religious objectives before demanding that Tentlil arrange for Cortes and the Spanish to meet with Moctezuma. The boldness of this demand amused Tentlil, who replied that it was unusual for a diplomat such as Cortes to make demands to meet a lord like Moctezuma, and that Moctezuma, no less a king than the one Cortes spoke of, would decide if and when they were to meet. Sensing an opportunity to send a message back to Moctezuma, Cortes consulted with his captains to display a ceremonial show of arms. Alvarado led a charge of horsemen and clanged swords in mock fighting to demonstrate the deadly advantages of Spanish steel. As a finale, Cortes ordered the firing of a cannon, which had its usual effect of sending the natives scattering in fright at the sound of it. The message was received by Tentlil, who would later return to Moctezuma a few days later with all the information he had managed to gather about the newcomers. Before he left, however, he observed a Spanish-style helmet and was fascinated by its appearance, which he said reminded him of Huitzilopochtli, patron god of the Mexica. Tentlil asked if he could take the helmet with him to Moctezuma to show. Cortes thought quickly. He answered that yes, Tentlil could take it, but he must return it filled with gold dust, because, as he claimed, the Spanish were sick with a disease of the heart whose only cure was gold. And so for now, the Spanish waited in the company of the Totonacs. Tentlil, on Moctezuma's orders, engaged in a lavish gift-giving show of diplomacy in order to gauge the Spanish reaction. When the next Mexica mission arrived in Totonac country, it came bearing gifts of gold, quetzal plumes, obsidian, turquoise, necklaces of jade set in gold, golden bells and necklaces, gold models of ducks, lions, jaguars, deers, and monkeys, and even arrows, bows of staffs of office, all in gold. There were numerous beautiful headdresses and fans of green feathers, some of which had gold attachments. There were also decorative cloaks, wigs, mirrors, shields, masks, jackets, sticks, earrings, diadems, breastplates, aigrettes, and buskins, with bells. They gave these to Cortes while he was aboard one of his ships anchored off the shore in a ceremony in which they announced their hope that, "The god will hear us. Your Lieutenant Moctezuma comes to give homage to you. He has the city of Mexico in his charge." And then they dressed Cortes in the style of a deity to pay further homage to him. These same emissaries looked upon Pedro de Alvarado and saw his large mane of blonde hair and were struck by its appearance, referring to him by the name which the Nahuas would reference him from then on, Tonatilla, which meant the daytime sunlight. Cortes received these gifts in a poor spirit. He bullied the emissaries, demanding more from them. He shackled them in chains and fired off a cannon from the deck of his ship. He challenged the men to a joust the following morning. He was testing them, probing them for weakness. The emissaries folded, asked for mercy. It was enough for Cortes. He unshackled the emissaries, and they ran to their canoes to set off for the shore and then Tenochtitlan as fast as they could. A few days later, Tentlil reappeared bearing more gifts, enormous wooden wheels coated in gold and silver. It was a gift that had been originally prepared for Grijalva a year earlier. The Spanish were notorious for taking all the finely crafted metals they received and melting them down into standard gold bars. But these wheels were so magnificent that the Spanish kept them as they were and prepared them, along with other tributes, to be sent back to the Spanish crown. Cortes asked again to meet Moctezuma in his capital, and again Tentlil rebuffed him, saying that Moctezuma himself had forbidden it, and there was nothing to be done. And so there really was nothing for Cortes and the other Spaniards to do but watch as Tentlil left them again. With Tentlil gone, the Spanish found themselves with ample gifts and a new resource they had not had before: time. They lazed about in Totonac country, at a loss of what to do next. Stories of the great empire to the west would not leave Cortes's mind. The riches that had vexed the Spanish project like a mirage in the New World now seemed to be materializing just beyond the western horizon in the land called Mexico. Cortes, the unrepentant gambler, prepared a scheme to double down on his insubordinate mission. But it was at this point that the Spanish found themselves at the terminus of the path mapped by the Cordoba and Grijalva's expeditions. Any movement further would now be off the map. The momentum that had carried the expedition forward and awkwardly sidestepped the Cortes question had now faltered. Without it, the tepid consensus that had held the men together began to split apart. Mutinous whispers compounded into open defiance and then outright threats of violence. The Velazquistas may have been willing to tolerate Cortes's flouting of the Cuban governor while he stuck to the plan the governor had approved anyway, but they rebelled at the idea of extrapolating those plans into a mission of marching on some rumored faraway capital. The Cortesista and Velazquista factions now argued the balance between ambition and treason. Meanwhile, food was running low. The Totonacs were providing what they could, but provisions and patience were strained. Humidity engulfed them as the men sweat underneath their hot armor. The Spanish spent the days simmering in resentment and heat and spent their nights boiling over into arguments. Tensions were rising fast. Violence felt inevitable. The issue of Cortes's ambition exceeding his authority could not be looked past any longer. If there was to be any continuation of this mission, as the Cortesistas hoped for, it would need to be done on different legal authority. It is a great irony that the Spanish were so intent on devising legal justifications for their legally unjustifiable actions in the Americas. But just as the Aztecs saw themselves inseparably bound to the will of the law of the gods, so the Spanish saw themselves as bound to God and country and the laws of each. Cortes offered a gesture to the Velasquistas. He gathered the treasure. He proclaimed all of it, not simply the royal fifth that was owed, would be sent back to the crown. It was meant to assure the men that continuing was not simply about enriching themselves, but serving their king. In the same breath, Cortes appealed to the men's greed. He showered them in tales and promises of future glory and gold. Even the Velasquistas, no less in debt than the Cortesistas, were taken in by such promises. Wealth had now eluded them back in Spain and the Caribbean, and they looked for opportunities where opportunities could be found. Loyalty to the crown and God seemed all too easily swayed with treasure. Cortes played the situation delicately, attempting to toe the line between the two camps as well as he could until the moment came to act. He had, as Hugh Thomas wrote, that capacity of all successful men of being able to conceal his real intentions until the pair which he coveted was ready to fall. But there was still one more play to be had. The pro-Cortes captains gathered together and conspired to incorporate this stretch of useless coast in Totonac country as a Spanish town, and, with it, a legal entity which could funnel their ambitions straight to the crown. Cortes would be elected this fictional town's mayor and be accountable to the king alone. Velázquez sidestepped entirely. The irony was that this was the same maneuver Velázquez had used to skirt the authority of his own patron, Diego Colón, back in Cuba. Cortes played the part of reluctant Cincinnatus perfectly, telling his captains he would accept their proposal if only they were to press him harder on it. The documents were drafted. La Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz was founded. It was the first of many inventions that would dress the later treasons into a palatable legal fiction Cortes knew the crown would accept, especially if it were accompanied by unimaginable riches. Some Velasquistas remained unmoved and demanded to return. Cortes relented, knowing his partisans would shout him down. They did so, and the appearance of spontaneous enthusiasm for Cortes's mission drowned out the last of the naysayers. This uprising of support would serve another purpose for Cortes. It allowed him to argue that his treason was done at the behest of popular support and that he was powerless to refuse. And so La Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz was born, not just a town, but a conspiracy in stone, a loophole that redefined the expedition as Cortes's own. It was a strategy based on an understanding of the medieval Spanish law known as the Siete Partidas, which made the Spanish town the foundational element of government, answerable only to the crown. Whether it was clever legality or outright mutiny would be argued in Spanish courts for decades. But in that moment, the plot was sealed. Cortes had rewritten the mission, and with it the fate of an empire. Whatever laws he had broken, Cortes would later say, were done in service to the king, and that, if laws have to be broken in order to reign, then let them be broken. Veracruz wasn't just a loophole colony. It was a printing press of reality. From here, Cortes began drafting the first of his relaciones, those long, breathless letters to the Spanish crown that blurred the line between petition and propaganda. On the surface, they were familiar, a genre of writing at the time meant to secure recognition, pardons, and the crown's blessing for actions already taken. But in Cortes's hands, they became something darker, the weaponization of narrative itself. Cortes knew his position was indefensible. He had betrayed Velázquez, broken the contract he had signed, and seized powers explicitly denied him. Yet in his letters, every violation was spun into loyal service, each act of mutiny transformed into a triumph for God and King. Written in a voice both groveling and defiant, he smothered treachery beneath a flood of words until disobedience looked like obedience carried out with too much zeal. And because these letters were contemporaneous, written as events unfolded, They became the bedrock of the conquest memory. Later chroniclers, Spanish, indigenous, sympathetic, hostile, wrote with decades of hindsight. But Cortes's vision was first, and therefore hardest to dislodge. Even today, historians circle his accounts like moths around the same flame, trying to read between the lines while still trapped inside his frame. Even the existence of the letter itself is a kind of frame. This first such letter has been lost, if it were ever written at all, and replaced in the chronology by another document dictated but not written by Cortes after the founding of Veracruz. Veracruz was not only the site of a legal coup, it was the birthplace of a narrative coup. It may be arguable if Cortes conquered Mexico, but he definitively conquered its history, ensuring that even 5 centuries later that so many of us still see it, however faintly, through his eyes. This has led to enormous misconceptions and distortions in the hall of mirrors that is the history of the Spanish-Aztec conflict. In the words of scholar Felipe Fernandez Ernesto, historians today are priests of a cult of truth, called to the service of a god whose existence they are doomed to doubt. Cortes had begun his expedition in defiance to the only law that might hold him accountable. In tracing the route set by his predecessors, he had been able to hand-wave away this as a technicality. But the rumors of glory and gold in Tenochtitlan had been too much for him to pass up, and so Cortes and his men invented a new law whose accountability rested with an authority thousands of kilometers away on the other side of an ocean. They were, in effect, unleashing themselves from all restraint. It is impossible to commit treason while you are the sole arbiter of the law. By the time the ink dried in Veracruz, the conquest was already half won, not on the battlefield, but in the archives. Velázquez had tried to outmaneuver Diego Colón with titles and commissions. Cortes simply outmaneuvered Velázquez with a town that existed more on paper than in reality, and with letters that turned mutiny into royal service. The Spaniards argued over provisions, treasure, and whose orders they were breaking. But none of that mattered once Cortes's words left the coast. Spain itself would read the conquest exactly as he wished it to be told. And that is the real terror at this point in the story. Not that Cortes had violated the law, but that he had already found a way to rewrite the law in his own image. The expedition had become a conspiracy of overlapping fictions. Velázquez's conquest dreams, Cortes's forged municipality, and above all, the Relaciones, letters that didn't just report history, but created it. From now on, every clash, every alliance, every betrayal would unfold in 2 theaters, the world of blood and smoke in Mexico, and the world of paper and ink in Spain. And in both, Cortes looked to seize the upper hand. Next time, we'll see the illusions of this conflict from the other side, as we examine the Mexica Tlatoani Moctezuma and understand the Tenochtitlan strategy at work as the Spanish set out to initiate the fated confrontation. But for now, that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated, and I hope to have you back here soon. Goodbye.